was about to start his interrogation when suddenly the two children came charging in, racing around the table, demanding a bedtime story. Robert Cornwallis raised his hands, trying to take control of the situation. "All right, you two, that's enough." The children ignored him. "Why don't you go out in the garden? As a special treat, you can have 10 minutes on the trampoline before bed." The children yelled with delight. Their father got up and opened the French windows. They ran out, and we watched as they climbed onto the trampoline. "Lovely kids," Hawthorne muttered, with all the malice in the world. "They can be a bit of a handful at this time of day." Cornwallis sat down again. "Where's Andrew?" He called over to his wife, who was standing beside the fridge with a half-full bottle of white wine. "Upstairs, doing his homework." "All playing on his computer," Cornwallis said. "I can't get him off it, but then he's 9. "All his friends are the same," Barbara agreed, pouring the wine. "I don't know what it is with children these days. They're not interested in the real world." There was a pause. In this house, a moment of silence was something of a luxury. "Irene told me about the funeral," Cornwallis began, echoing what Barbara had said in the hall. "I cannot tell you how dismayed I am. I've been 10 years in this business. My father ran the company before me, and my grandfather before that. I can assure you that nothing like this has ever happened before." Hawthorne was about to ask him something, but he continued. "I am particularly sorry that I wasn't there. I try to be present at every funeral, but, as I'm sure Irene will have told you, it was my son's school play." "He spent weeks learning his lines," Barbara exclaimed. "Every night before bed. He took it very seriously." She had filled a large glass with wine and came over and joined us. "He would never have forgiven us if we hadn't been there. Acting runs in his blood. It's all he ever talks about. And he was absolutely brilliant. Well, I would say that, wouldn't I? But he was. I shouldn't have gone. I knew it at the time. I had this gut feeling that something was going to go wrong." "Why was that, Mr. Cornwallis?" He thought back. "Well, everything about Mrs. Cooper's death has been unusual. It may surprise you, but I am no stranger to violent crime, Mr. Hawthorne. We have another branch in South London, and we have been summoned by the police on more than one occasion. Knife crime, gang violence. But in this instance, for Mrs. Cooper to have arranged her funeral the very day that it would be required—" "You said to me you were worried about it," Barbara agreed. "Only this morning, when you were getting dressed, you were going on about it." She ran her eyes over him. "Why are you still in that suit? I thought you were going to get changed." Barbara Cornwallis was a pleasant, friendly woman, but she never stopped talking, and being married to her would have driven me insane. Her husband ignored her last question. "That was why I asked Irene to be there," he explained. "I knew there would be police and journalists, and, of course, Damien Cooper had a certain celebrity. I didn't trust Alfred to handle it on his own. Even so, I should have stayed." "You never even got to talk to Damien Cooper." There was a bowl of crisps on the table. Barbara slid them towards herself and took a handful. In the garden, the boys were bouncing up and down. We could hear their excited laughter on the other side of the double glazing. "And he's one of your favourite actors, too." "That's true. We've seen everything he's done. What was the television programme he was in, the one about the journalists?" "I can't remember, dear." "Of course you can remember. You bought the DVD. You've watched it lots of times." "State of Play." "That's the one. I couldn't follow it myself, but he was very good. And we saw him in the theatre, didn't we, in Oscar Wilde, The Importance of Being Earnest? I took Robert for our anniversary." She turned to her husband. "We both thought he was brilliant." "He was a very good actor," Cornwallis agreed. "But I would never have approached him at his mother's funeral, even if the opportunity had arisen. It wouldn't have been appropriate." He allowed himself a little joke. "I was hardly going to ask him for an autograph." "Well, I've some news that may surprise you," Hawthorne said. He helped himself to a single crisp, holding it as if it were evidence. "Damien Cooper is also dead." "What?" Cornwallis stared at him. "He was murdered this afternoon, just an hour or so after the funeral." "What are you talking about? That's impossible." Cornwallis looked completely shocked. I would have thought the news had already been on TV, on the internet, but the two of them must have been too busy with their children to have seen it. "How was he killed?" Barbara asked. She looked shocked too. "He was stabbed, in his flat in Brick Lane." "Do you know who did it?" "Not yet. I'm surprised Detective Inspector Meadows hasn't been in touch with you. We haven't heard anything. Cornwallis gazed at us, searching for words. What happened at the funeral? Is there a connection? I mean, there must be. When Irene told me about it, I thought it was just an unpleasant joke. Someone with a grudge. That's what you said? Barbara reminded him. That seemed the obvious conclusion, but, as I said, it was completely outside my experience. But if Damien's been killed, I would imagine that puts everything in a very different light. Hawthorne had had second thoughts about the crisp. He dropped it back in the bowl. Somebody put an MP3 recording alarm clock inside the coffin. It went off at 11:30 and played a nursery rhyme. I think it's a safe bet that there's a connection. So I want to know how it got there. I have no idea. Well, why don't you have a little think for a minute? Hawthorne was on edge. I think the mess of the place, the children bouncing up and down, Barbara with her wine and her crisps, everything about Willesden Green was beginning to get on his nerves. Cornwallis looked at his wife as if seeking her support. I can assure you that it wasn't placed there by anyone who works for me. Everyone at Cornwallis and Sons has been with the company for at least 5 years, and many of them are part of the family. I'm sure Irene told you. Mrs. Cooper was taken directly from the hospital to our central mortuary at Hammersmith. We washed her and closed her eyes. Mrs. Cooper did not wish to be embalmed. Nobody asked to view the body. Even if they had, there would have been no opportunity to do anything amiss. She was placed in the natural willow-weave coffin which she had chosen. That would have been around 9:30 this morning. I wasn't there, but all 4 pallbearers would have been in the room. She was then carried to the hearse. We have a private courtyard with an electric gate, so no one can come in off the street. From there, she was taken directly to Brompton Cemetery. So she would have been in someone's sight all the time? Yes. As far as I can see, there were perhaps 3 or 4 minutes when the coffin was left unattended, when it was in the car park behind the chapel. And, incidentally, I shall make sure that in the future this never happens again. But that was when the alarm clock could have been put in the coffin? Yes, I suppose so. How easy would it have been to open it? Cornwallis considered. It would have been the work of just a few moments. If it had been a traditional coffin made of solid wood, the lid would have been screwed down, but with a willow coffin there are just 2 straps. Barbara had finished her drink. You sure you won't have a glass of wine? She asked us. No, thank you, I said. Well, I'm going to have another. All this talk about murder and death. We never discuss Robert's work in the house, usually. The children hate it. At Andrew's school, they had to give a talk about their dad's business in front of the whole class. He made everything up. He said Robert was an accountant. She gave a hoot of laughter. I don't know where he got his facts from. It doesn't have anything about accountancy. She went to the fridge and poured herself a second glass of wine. As she closed the fridge door, another boy came in, wearing tracksuit trousers and a T-shirt. He was taller than the other 2, with darker hair that fell clumsily over his face. Why are Tobes and Seb in the garden? He asked. He noticed us. Who are you? This is Andrew, Barbara said. These men are policemen. Why? What's happened? It's nothing for you to worry about, Andrew. Have you finished your homework? The boy nodded. Then you can watch television if you want to. She smiled at him, showing him off. I was just telling these gentlemen about your school play, Mr. Pinocchio. He wasn't very good, Cornwallis said. Then he mimed his nose stretching. Wait a minute, that's a lie. He was brilliant. Andrew plumped himself out, pleased with himself. I'm going to be an actor when I grow up, he announced. Let's not talk about that right now, Andrew, Cornwallis interrupted him. If you want to help, you can go out and tell your brothers it's time for bed. Out in the garden, Toby and Sebastian had moved on to the climbing frame. They were shouting at each other, overtired, sliding into that zone where they lost almost any resemblance to rational human beings. It was something I remembered well from my own children. Andrew nodded and did as he had been told. Can I ask you something? I knew I was risking Hawthorne's anger, but I was interested. It's not completely relevant, but I'd like to know why you chose this line of work. Being an undertaker? Cornwallis didn't seem bothered by the question. In a way, it chose me. You saw the sign above the door of our South Kensington office. It's a family business. I think it was started by my great-great-grandfather, and it's always been in the family. I've 2 cousins working in it. You met Irene. My cousin George does the books. Maybe one of my boys will take it over one day. Chance will be a fine thing. Barbara scoffed. They may change their minds. Like you did. It's not very easy for young people these days. It'll be good for them to know there's a job for them if they want it. He turned back to us. After I left college, I did other things. I travelled, and in my own way, I suppose I sowed a few wild oats. There was a part of me that resisted the idea of becoming a funeral director, but if I hadn't joined the firm, my life would have been very different. He reached out and took hold of his wife's hand. It was how we met. It was my uncle's funeral. One of the very first where I was officiating. Cornwallis smiled. It's probably not the most romantic way to meet your life partner, but it was the best thing that came out of that day. I never much liked Uncle David anyway, Barbara said. It was getting dark outside, and the two children were now arguing with their older brother, who was trying to bring them in. I'm afraid if you have no more questions, we're going to have to ask you to leave, Cornwallis said. We have to get the boys into bed. Hawthorne got to his feet. You've been very helpful, he said. I wasn't sure if this was true. Can you let us know if you find anything? Barbara asked. It's hard to believe that Damien Cooper's been killed. His mother first, then him. Makes you wonder who'll be next. She went outside to gather up her children, while Cornwallis took us to the door. There was one other thing I thought I ought to mention to you, he said as we stood on the crazy paving outside in the grey light. I'm just not sure if it's relevant or not. Go on, Hawthorne said. Well, 2 days ago I got a telephone call. It was someone wanting to know where and when the funeral was going to take place. It was a man at the other end of the line. He said he was a friend of Diana Cooper and that he wanted to attend, but he refused to give me his name. In fact, his entire manner was, how can I put it, rather suspicious. I won't say he was deranged, but he certainly sounded as if he was under a lot of strain. He was nervous. He wouldn't even tell me where he was calling from. How did he know you were in charge of the funeral? I wondered about that myself, Mr. Hawthorne. I imagine he must have telephoned all the undertakers in West London making the same inquiry, although we're one of the largest and best respected, so he could have started with us first. Anyway, I didn't think very much of it at the time. I simply gave him the details that he wanted, but when Irene told me the awful things that had happened today, well, of course I was reminded of him. I don't suppose you have his number? Yes, I do. We keep a record of all our incoming calls, and he rang me from a mobile, so his number showed up on our system. Cornwallis took out a folded piece of paper and handed it to Hawthorne. I was in two minds whether to give this to you, to be honest. I don't want to get anyone into any trouble. We'll look into it, Mr. Cornwallis. It's probably nothing, a waste of time. I've got a lot of time. Cornwallis went back inside and closed the door. Hawthorne unfolded the paper and looked at it. He smiled. I know this number, he said. How come? It's the same number Judith Godwin gave me at her place in Harrow-on-the-Hill. It's for her husband, Alan Godwin. Hawthorne folded the piece of paper and slipped it into his pocket. He was smiling, as if it had been something he had expected all along. 15. Lunch with Hilda. You've bought new shoes, my wife said, as I left home the following Monday. No, I haven't, I replied. I looked down and saw that I was wearing the shoes that Hawthorne had given me, the ones that had belonged to Damien Cooper. They were comfortable, Italian, but I had put them on without thinking. Oh, these, I muttered. My wife is a television producer. She has such an extraordinary eye for detail that she could easily be a detective or a spy. I stood there, awkwardly. I hadn't told her anything about Hawthorne. I've had them for some time, I said. I just don't often wear them. We don't lie to each other. Both statements were, broadly, true. Where are you going? She asked. Lunch with Hilda, I said. Hilda Stark was my literary agent. I hadn't told her about Hawthorne either. I left as quickly as I could. The relationship between writers and their agents is a peculiar one, and I'm not even sure I fully understand it myself. Starting with the basics, writers need agents. Most writers are hopeless when it comes to contracts, deals, invoicing, in fact anything to do with business or common sense. Agents handle all of this in return for 10% of what you earn, a figure which is actually very reasonable until you start selling a lot of books, but when that happens you no longer care. They don't do very much else. They won't really get you work. If they manage to raise your advance, it will be by quite a lot less than the amount they're taking for themselves. An agent is not exactly your friend, or if they are, they're a particularly flirtatious one with dozens of other clients whom they're equally pleased to see. They may tentatively ask about your wife or children, but actually it's the progress of your new book that most interests them. It could be said that they have a one-track mind, and that it's perfectly in sync with Nielsen, the company that scans and tracks UK book sales. 1 week after I have a book published, Hilda will ring to tell me where it is in the charts, even though she knows I hate it. Book sales aren't everything, I will tell her, and that, in a nutshell, is the difference between us. I remember meeting her at City Airport shortly after she had taken me on. We were on our way to Edinburgh for a talk I was giving, and I was already surprised that she'd agreed to come. Didn't she have a home to go to, a family? I would never find out. She didn't invite me to her home, and I've never met her family. When I saw her, on the other side of security, she was yelling at someone on her mobile, and she signalled me not to interrupt. It took me about 10 seconds to work out that it was a publisher at the other end, and another 10 seconds to realise that it was my publisher. She had put on her shoes, belt, jacket, and marched into the airport branch of W.H. Smith, where she had discovered that my new book wasn't stocked. She wanted to know why. That was Hilda. Before I signed with her, I met her at book fairs in Dubai, Hong Kong, Cape Town, Edinburgh, and Sydney. She knew everything about me. How well my latest book was doing, why my editor had just resigned, who was going to replace her. She really was the genie to my Aladdin, although, as far as I could recall, I had never rubbed the magic lamp. It was inevitable that I would sign with her, and in the end I did. I was far from her biggest author, by the way. Her talent was in making me believe that, actually, I was. I always had to remind myself that, theoretically, she worked for me, and not the other way round. Even so, I was always nervous when I was meeting her. She was a short, sharply dressed woman, with tightly curled hair and very intense, searching eyes. Everything about her was tough. The way she jabbed her finger at you, the staccato phrases, the lack of emotion, the dress sense. She swore almost as much as Hawthorne. I liked her and feared her in equal measure. I knew that I was going to have to tell her about the book I was writing. She would sell it. She would do the deal. I also knew that she would be annoyed that I had gone ahead without asking her first, which is why I held back for as long as I could, talking about anything else that mattered. Marketing for the House of Silk, the possibility of a new Alex Rider. I had an idea for a book about Yasen Grigorovich, the assassin who had appeared in several of the adventures. ITV and the scheduling of Injustice, the next season of Foyle's War, if there was actually going to be one. Hilda was unusually twitchy, even by her standards, and as the waiter cleared the plates, I asked her what was wrong. "I wasn't going to mention it," she said, "but you'll probably read about it in the newspapers anyway. One of my clients has been arrested." "Who?" "Raymond Clunes." "The theatre producer?" She nodded. "He raised money for a musical last year, Moroccan Nights. It didn't do as well as expected." Hilda would never call anything a total flop, even if it had lost every penny. If a book was savaged by the critics, she would still find the single word that would allow her to claim it had had mixed reviews. Now, some of the backers are alleging that he misled them. He's being investigated for fraud. So the story that Bruno Wang had told me after the funeral was true. I was surprised. I didn't even know that Hilda represented theatrical producers, and wondered if she had lost money herself. I didn't dare ask. But this was the opening I'd been looking for. I began by saying that I had recently met Clunes, that he'd been at Diana Cooper's funeral. This got me talking about Hawthorne, and finally I described the book I had agreed to write. She wasn't angry. Hilda never shouted at her clients. Incredulous would be a more accurate description. "I really don't understand you," she said. "We've talked about moving you out of children's books and establishing you as an adult author. This is an adult book. It's true crime. You're not a true crime writer, and anyway, true crime doesn't sell." She reached for her wine glass. "I don't think this is a good idea. You've got The House of Silk coming out in a few months, and you know how much I like that book. I thought the idea we agreed was that you were going to write a sequel. I will. You should be working on that now. That's what people are going to want to read. Why should anyone be interested in this? What's he called? Hawthorne. Daniel Hawthorne, but he doesn't use his first name. They never do. He's a detective. He used to be a detective. So he's an unemployed detective. The Unemployed Detective, is that what you're going to call the book? Do you have a title yet? No. She threw back the wine. I really don't understand what's attracted you to this. Do you like him? Not terribly, I admitted. Then why will anyone else? He's very clever. I knew how feeble that sounded. He hasn't solved the case. Well, he's still working on it. The waiter arrived with the main courses, and I told her about some of the interviews where I'd been present. The trouble was, apart from the notes I'd taken, I hadn't written anything down yet, and in the telling, it all sounded very vague and anecdotal. Boring, even. Imagine trying to describe in detail the plot of an Agatha Christie. That was how it was for me. In the end, she interrupted. "Who is this man, Hawthorne?" she asked. "What makes him fun? Does he drink single malt whiskey? Does he drive a classic car? Does he like jazz or opera? Does he have a dog?" "I don't know anything about him," I said miserably. "He used to be married, and he has an 11-year-old son. He may have pushed someone down a flight of stairs at Scotland Yard. He doesn't like gay people. I don't know why. Is he gay?" "No. He hates talking about himself. He won't let me come close." "Then how can you write about him?" "If he solves the case—" "Some cases can take years to solve. Are you going to follow him around London for the rest of your life?" She had ordered veal escalope. She sliced into it as if it had caused her offence. "You're going to have to change names," she added. "You can't just barge into people's houses and put them in a book." She glared at me. "You'd better change my name. I don't want to be in it." "Look, at the end of the day, this is an interesting case," I insisted, "and I think Hawthorne is an interesting man. I'm going to try and find out more about him." "How?" "There's a detective I met. I'll start with him." I was thinking about Charlie Meadows. Maybe he'd talk to me if I bought him a drink. "Have you talked to Mr. Hawthorne about money?" Hilda asked, chewing on her veal. It was the question I had been dreading. "I suggested 50-50. "What?" She almost threw down her knife and fork. "That's ridiculous," she said. "You've written 40 novels. You're an established writer. He's an out-of-work detective. If anything, he should be paying you to write about him, and certainly he shouldn't be getting more than 20%. "It's his story." "But you're the one writing it." She sighed. "Do you really mean to go ahead with this?" "It's a bit late to back out now," I said. "Anyway, I'm not sure I want to. I was there in the room, Hilda. I actually saw the dead body, cut to ribbons, covered in blood." I glanced at my steak, then put down my knife and fork. "I want to know who did it." "All right." She gave me the sort of look that said no good would come of this, but it wasn't her fault. "Give me his number, I'll talk to him. But I should warn you now, you're still under contract for 2 more books, and at least one of them is meant to be set in the 19th century. I'm not sure your publishers are going to be interested in this." 50-50, I said. "Over my dead body." After lunch, I headed off to Victoria, feeling like a schoolboy playing truant. Why was I suddenly hiding everything from everyone? I hadn't told my wife anything about Hawthorne, and here I was slipping off to meet him again without having mentioned it to Hilda. Hawthorne was worming his way into my life in a way that was definitely unhealthy. The worst of it was that I was actually looking forward to seeing him, to finding out what happened next. What I just said to Hilda was true. I was hooked. I don't like Victoria and hardly ever go there. Why would I? It's a weird part of London on the wrong side of Buckingham Palace. As far as I know, it has no decent restaurants, no shops selling anything anyone could possibly want, no cinemas, and just a couple of theatres that feel cut off and separated from their natural home in Shaftesbury Avenue. Victoria Station is so old-fashioned you almost expect a steam train to pull in, and the moment you step outside, you find yourself lost in a haphazard junction of shabby, seedy streets that all look the same. In recent years, they've introduced cheerful guides who stand on the forecourt of the station in bowler hats, giving tourists advice. The only advice I'd give them is to go somewhere else. This was where Alan Godwin worked, running a company that organised conferences and social events for businesses. His office was on the second floor of a 1960s building that had weathered badly, at the end of a narrow street crowded with unappetising cafes close to the coach station. It was raining when I arrived. It had been cloudy all day, and with the puddles on the pavements and the coaches spraying water as they rumbled past, I could hardly imagine anywhere I would less like to be. The sign on the door read, "Dear Boy Events," and it took me a moment to work out where it had come from. It was a quotation from Harold Macmillan, who had once been asked what politicians should fear. His answer was, "Events, dear boy, events." I was shown into a small, unevenly shaped reception room, and I didn't need to be a detective to see the way this business was going. The furniture was expensive, but it was getting tired, and the trade magazines spread out on the table were out of date. The potted plants were wilting. The receptionist was bored and didn't make any attempt to disguise it. Her telephone wasn't ringing. There were a few awards on display on a shelf, handed out by organisations I'd never heard of. Hawthorne was already there, sitting on a sofa with that sense of impatience I was beginning to know so well. It was as if he was addicted to crime and couldn't wait to begin his next interrogation. "You're late," he said. I looked at my watch. It was 3:05. "How are you?" I asked. "How was your weekend?" "It was all right." "Did you do anything? Did you see a film?" He looked at me curiously. "What's the matter with you?" "Nothing." I was thinking about my lunch with Hilda. I sat down opposite him. "Did you know that Raymond Clunes has been arrested?" He nodded. "I saw it in the papers. When he took that 50 grand off Diana Cooper, it looks like he was ripping her off." "Maybe she knew something about him. Could have given him a reason to kill her." Hawthorne considered my suggestion in a way that told me he had already dismissed it. "Is that what you think?" "It's possible." A young girl came into the reception area and told us, in a hopeless tone of voice, that Mr. Godwin would see us. She led us down a short corridor past 2 offices, both of them empty, I noticed. There was a door at the end. She opened it. "Here are your visitors, Mr. Godwin." We went in. I knew Alan Godwin at once. I'd seen him at the funeral. He had been the tall man with the straggly hair and the white handkerchief. Now he was sitting behind a desk with a window behind him and a view of the coach station over his shoulder. He was wearing a sports jacket and a round-necked jersey. He recognised us too as we came in. He knew that we had seen him at the cemetery. His face fell. There were 2 seats opposite the desk. We sat down. "You're a police officer?" He examined Hawthorne nervously. "I'm working with the police, that's right." "I wonder if I could see some sort of identification." "I wonder if you could tell me what you were doing at Brompton Cemetery. And for that matter, what you did when you left." Godwin didn't say anything, so Hawthorne went on. "The police don't know you were there, but I do. And if I tell them, I'm sure they'll be very interested to talk to you. Frankly, I think you'd find it a lot easier talking to me." Godwin seemed to sink into his chair. Looked at more closely, he was a man weighed down by failure. It was hardly surprising. The accident that had taken one of his sons and cruelly injured the other had been the start of a general unravelling, which had seen him lose his home, his marriage, and his business. I knew he was going to answer Hawthorne's questions. He had almost no fight left in him. "I didn't commit any crime going to the funeral," he said. "That may or may not be the case. You heard that music, the wheels on the bus. If memory serves, that one comes under the Burial Laws Amendment Act, riotous, violent, or indecent behaviour at a funeral. But I suppose you could equally well pull it down to breaking and entering. Someone broke into the coffin and inserted a music box. Do you know anything about that?" "No." "But you saw what happened?" "Yes, of course." "Did that song mean anything to you?" Godwin paused, and for a moment I saw 2 deep pits of despair opening in his eyes. "We played it when we buried Timothy," he rasped. "It was his favourite song." Even Hawthorne faltered at that, but only briefly. Straight away he was back on the attack.
So why were you there? He demanded. Why go to the funeral of a woman you had every reason to hate?
It was because I hated her. Godwin's cheeks had reddened. He had heavy black eyebrows, which accentuated his anger. That woman, with her stupidity and her carelessness, killed my son, an 8-year-old boy, and turned his brother, who was a live wire and who could make anybody laugh, turned him into pretty much a vegetable. She wasn't wearing her glasses, and she destroyed my life. I went to the funeral because I was delighted she was dead, and I wanted to see her put in the ground. I thought it would give me closure.
And did it?
No.
How about the death of Damien Cooper?
Hawthorne could have been a tennis player, slamming the ball back across the net. He had the same coiled-up energy, the same focus. Godwin sneered. Do you think I killed him, Mr. Hawthorne? Is that why you asked me what I did after the funeral? I went for a long walk down the King's Road and then beside the River Thames. Yes, I know, that's very convenient, isn't it? No witnesses. Nobody to tell you where I was. But why would I have wished him any harm? He wasn't driving the car. He was at home.
His mother drove away, maybe to protect him.
That was her decision. It was cowardly and selfish, but he had nothing to do with it. That chimed in with what I had been thinking. Alan Godwin might have a good reason to kill Diana Cooper, but I couldn't see how it could be extended to her son. Both men had stopped as if they were in a boxing ring and had come to the end of a round. Then Hawthorne weighed in again.
You went to see Mrs. Cooper?
Godwin hesitated. No.
Don't lie to me, Mr. Godwin. I know you were there.
How do you know?
Mrs. Cooper told her son. She was scared of you. According to him, you threatened her.
I did no such thing. He stopped himself and took a breath. All right, I went to see her. I don't see why I should deny it. It was about 3 or 4 weeks ago.
2 weeks before she died.
I'll tell you when it was. It was 2 weeks after Judith asked me to leave the house, when we finally realized our marriage couldn't be saved. That's when I went to see her, because it occurred to me that maybe, just maybe, she might be able to help. I thought she might even want to.
Help you? In what way?
With money. What do you think? He drew a breath. I might as well tell you what you want to know, because, you know what, I don't really give a damn anymore. There's nothing left. My company's down the pan. Businesses don't want to spend anymore. Not on corporate events. Gordon Brown ran this bloody country into the ground, and the new lot don't have a clue. So everyone's tightening their belts, and people like me are the first out the door. Judith and me, we're finished too. 24 years of marriage, and you suddenly wake up and realise that you can't bear to be in the same room. That's what she said, anyway. He pointed at the ceiling. There's a 1-bedroom flat upstairs, and that's where I'm living now. I'm 55 years old, and I'm boiling eggs on a single gas ring, or bringing in Big Macs in brown paper bags. That's what my life has come to. I can put up with all that, I don't care. But do you know what really hurts? Why I went to see that bloody woman? We're losing my house. The house in Harrow-on-the-Hill. We can't keep up with the mortgage repayments. And even that wouldn't matter to me, except it's Jeremy's house. It's his home. It's the one place he feels safe. Anger sparked in his eyes. If I could find any way to protect him from that, I would do it. So that is why I swallowed my dignity and went to see Mrs. Cooper. I thought she could help. She had a nice address in Chelsea, and from what I read in the newspaper, that son of hers was making a fortune out in Hollywood. I thought, maybe, if she had a shred of decency in her, she might like to make amends for what she'd done and actually help my family by reaching into her pocket.
And did she?
What do you think? The sneer was back in place. She tried to slam the door in my face, and when I forced my way in, she threatened to call the police.
You forced your way in? What exactly do you mean by that?
Hawthorne asked. I mean, I persuaded her to let me speak to her. I didn't make any threats. I didn't use violence. I almost got down on my bloody knees asking her for 10 minutes of her time. He paused. All I wanted was alone. Was it so much to ask? I had a couple of pictures coming up. I might have been able to turn a corner. I just needed a bit of breathing space. But she wasn't having any of it. I don't know how any human being can be so bloody cold, so removed. She told me to leave her house, and that's exactly what I did. I actually felt sick with myself for having gone in the first place. Just shows you how desperate I was.
Which room did this happen in, Mr. Godwin?
The front room, the living room. Why?
What time?
It was lunchtime, around midday.
So, the curtains were tied back?
Yes. He was puzzled by the question.
How did you know she'd be in?
I didn't know. I went round on the off chance.
And later on, you sent her a letter?
Godwin hesitated very briefly. Yes.
Hawthorne reached into his jacket pocket and took out the letter which he had been given by Andrea Kluvanek. So much had happened in the last few days that I'd almost forgotten about it. He unfolded it. I have been watching you, and I know the things that are dear to you, he read. You say you didn't threaten her, but that sounds pretty threatening to me.
I was angry. I didn't mean anything by it.
When did you send it?
I didn't. I hand-delivered it.
When?
It was about a week after I'd seen her, a Friday. I suppose it must have been the 6th or the 7th.
The weekend before she died?
I didn't go into the house. I just put it through the door.
Did she reply?
No. I never heard a word from her. Hawthorne glanced at the letter again.
What do you mean, the things that are dear to you?
I didn't mean anything. Godwin pounded his fist on the desk. It was just words. You put yourself in my position. It was stupid going to see her. It was stupid writing the letter. But when people are pushed into a corner, sometimes they do stupid things.
Mrs. Cooper had a cat, Hawthorne said. A Persian grey. Don't suppose you saw it?
No, I didn't see any fucking cat. And actually, I've got nothing else to say to you. You haven't shown me any ID. I don't know who you are. I want you to leave. A telephone rang in the office next door. It was the only sound we'd heard since we'd entered the building.
How much longer before you move out of it? Hawthorne asked.
I've got the lease for another 3 months.
Then we'll know where to find you.
We walked through the almost empty office and back out into the rain. Hawthorne immediately lit a cigarette.
I'm going to Canterbury tomorrow, he suddenly announced. You up for that?
Why Canterbury? I asked.
I've tracked down Nigel Weston.
I'd forgotten who this was.
Nigel Weston, QC, Hawthorne reminded me. The judge who let Diana Cooper go free. And after that I thought I'd wander over to Deal. You might like that, Tony. Get a bit of sea air.
All right, I said, although I didn't really want to leave London. I was being dragged into unfamiliar territory in every sense, and I didn't feel comfortable having Hawthorne as my guide.
I'll see you then.
We went our separate ways, and it was only when I got to the end of the street that I remembered the one question I had been meaning to ask. Alan Godwin had said that he was glad she had been killed. In his own words, he was delighted. But when I had seen him at the funeral, he had been crying. His handkerchief had been constantly at his eyes. Why? And there was something else. She wasn't wearing her glasses, and she destroyed my life. That was what he had said just now, his voice half strangled by anger. But there had been another witness, Raymond Clunes, talking about Diana Cooper, and he had said something quite different. As soon as I got home, I looked through my notes and found what I was looking for. It was something that Hawthorne had missed. But it had been there all along, in front of our eyes, the reason why both the mother and the son had to die, and it told me precisely who had killed them. In fact, it was obvious. Suddenly, I was looking forward to our train journey to Canterbury. For once, I had the upper hand. 16. Detective Inspector Meadows. With the end of the book in sight, I realised I needed more background. It was time to get in touch with Detective Inspector Charles Meadows. In fact, that turned out to be quite easy. I called the Metropolitan Police, gave his name, and was immediately patched through, to his mobile, I think. I could hear a pneumatic drill in the background as we talked. At first, when I told him who I was and why I wanted to see him, he was suspicious. He started making excuses, and would have hung up if I hadn't, frankly, bribed him. That is, I offered him £50 for an hour of his time, and suggested we meet at a pub where I could buy him a drink. Warily, he agreed, although I had a feeling he didn't need much persuading. He didn't like Hawthorne, and would surely take any opportunity to do him down. We met that evening at the Groucho Club in Soho. He'd asked for a central London location, and I thought he'd be impressed by a private club known for its celebrity clientele. I also knew we could get a seat. He arrived 10 minutes late, by which time I'd bagged a quiet corner upstairs. He ordered a vodka martini, which surprised me. The triangular glass looked ridiculous in his oversized hands, and he took just 3 gulps before he needed, and asked for, another. I had a lot of questions for him, but first he wanted to know about me. How had I come across Hawthorne? Why was I writing a book about him? How much had he paid me? I told him how we had met, and why I had agreed to do the job without being paid, and made it clear that I had misgivings about Hawthorne too, that he wasn't my friend. Meadows smiled at this. "A man like Hawthorne doesn't have that many friends," he said. "I've nicked thieves and rapists who are more popular than him." So I told him about Injustice, how we had worked together, and how he had approached me, effectively, to write about his most recent case. I didn't mention the encounter at Hay-on-Wye that had changed my mind. "It just sounded interesting," I said. "I write a lot about murder, but I've never met anyone quite like Hawthorne." He smiled a second time. "There aren't many people like Hawthorne around, thank God." "Why exactly do you dislike him?" "What makes you think I dislike him? I don't give a toss about him, to be perfectly honest. I just don't think it's right to employ people like him to do police work when he's not a policeman." "I'd like to know what happened. Why was he fired?" "Did you tell him you were seeing me?" "No, but he knows I'm writing about him. It's what he asked me to do, and I told him I'd find out everything I could about him." "Bit of a detective yourself, then?" That had occurred to me. I wondered what anyone would make of us if they glanced in our direction. Built like a rugby player, with his broken nose, lank hair, and cheap suit, Meadows didn't look anything like the usual sort of person who drank at the Groucho. Like Hawthorne, there was something indefinably threatening about him. The waiter brought over a bowl of twiglets, and he plunged his hand into it. When he pulled it out again, the bowl was half empty. "What did he tell you about the murder squad?" Crunch, crunch, crunch. The rest of our interview would be punctuated by those damned snacks being mechanically ground between his teeth. He didn't tell me anything. I know almost nothing about him. I'm not even sure where he lives. River Court, Blackfriars. That was only a mile or so from my own flat in Clerkenwell. It's quite a fancy place. Views out onto the Thames. I don't know what the arrangement is. He doesn't own it. Do you know the number? He shook his head. No. He told me he had a place in Gants Hill. He lost that when he split up from his wife. That's what I thought. I paused. Did you ever meet her? Once. She came to the office. About 5'11", Caucasian. He was describing her as if she were a suspect in an investigation. She was quite pretty. Fair hair, a few years younger than him. Bit nervous. She asked to see him and I took her to his desk. What did they talk about? I haven't got the faintest idea. No one ever hung around with Hawthorne. I made myself scarce. So what was he like to work with? You couldn't work with him. That was his problem. Crunch, crunch, crunch. He wasn't enjoying the twiglets. He was just eating them. Can I have another of these? He raised his glass. I signalled at the waiter. Hawthorne came to us in 2005, he said. He'd been in other sub-commands, in Sutton and Hendon, and they weren't having him, and we soon found out why. They say there's a lot of competition working in murder.
It's true that the teams can be at each other's throats, but at the same time we rub along. We'll drink together after work, we try to help each other out. But he wasn't like that. He was a loner. And if you want the truth, nobody likes a loner. I'm not saying people didn't respect him, he was bloody good at the job and he got results. We have something called the Murder Manual. You ever heard of that? I can't say I have. Well, there's no secret about it. You can download the whole thing on the internet if you want to look at it. It came out about 20 years ago, and it's the definitive guide to homicide investigation. It says that on page 1. Basically, it's the manual to everything from first response to crime scene strategy to house and post-mortem procedure. And there are some investigating officers who carry it around with them like born-again Christians with their Bible. That's the thing about our job. Process is king. The trouble is, you can take it too far. There was one man I knew, he was investigating a skeleton that had been dug up in the crypt of a church, victim of a murder that had taken place back in the 50s. He was trying to work out a CCTV strategy, because that's what it tells you to do in the manual, even though it was 25 years before CCTV was invented. Now, the thing about Hawthorne was, he did things his own way. He'd just disappear without so much as a buy your leave, because he had a hunch, or maybe it's just a lucky guess, or Christ knows really how he knew. But almost every single time he was right. That's what pissed people off. He had an arrest record that was second to none.
So what didn't they like?
Everything. On a day-to-day basis, he was a pain in the arse. He was rude to the boss, he never clicked with anyone, and he didn't drink. I'm not holding that against him, but it didn't help. 7 o'clock in the evening, he'd disappear. Maybe he went home to his wife, although I heard whispers he was playing in the field. That's no matter. If he'd made a few more friends, maybe there'd have been someone to stand by him when the shit hit the fan.
You told me not to go near any stairs.
Oh, I shouldn't have said that, really. I couldn't resist having a dig at Hawthorne.
The third vodka martini arrived. He threw it back.
There was a man called Derek Abbott, a 62-year-old retired teacher living in Brentford, who'd been arrested as part of Operation Spade. It was an international operation involving 50 countries looking into the trafficking of child pornography by mail and internet. It had started in Canada, and eventually there'd been more than 300 arrests. Abbott was suspected of being the main distributor in the UK, and so he'd been brought in for questioning. I'm not even sure what he was doing in Putney, but there he was. Anyway, he was in a custody office, which was on the second floor. He'd been booked in, pocket searched and all the rest of it. And someone had taken him to the interview room, which was in the basement. Normally that would have been a civilian, but there was nobody around, and to this day I don't quite know what happened, but Hawthorne volunteered. He took him down a corridor to a staircase. I forgot to mention he decided that Abbott needed to be handcuffed. There was no need for that. He was in his 60s, he had no history of violence. Well, you've probably guessed what happened next. And a guess is all we have, because the CCTV wasn't working in that part of the building. Abbott swore that Hawthorne tripped him. Hawthorne denied it. All I can tell you is that Abbott went headfirst down 14 steps, and because his hands were cuffed behind his back, there was nothing to break his fall.
How badly was he hurt? Meadows shrugged.
Did his neck in, broke a few bones. He could have been killed. And if so, Hawthorne would probably be in jail. As it was, Abbott was in no position to make too much fuss, and basically the whole thing was hushed up. As said, it couldn't all be brushed under the carpet. Too many people knew. And like I say, too many people had it in for him. So, Hawthorne got the boot.
There was nothing particularly surprising about this story. I'd always been aware of a sort of smouldering violence in Hawthorne's makeup, a sense of outrage, even, ironically, injustice. If he was going to kick someone down a flight of stairs, of course it would be a paedophile. It reminded me of his behaviour when we had visited Raymond Clunes. Was he homophobic? I asked.
How would I know?
He must have said something. Even if he wasn't very sociable, he must have expressed an opinion. Maybe if he'd read something in the newspaper or seen something on TV.
No.
Meadows looked in the twiglet bowl. It was empty.
People don't express opinions in the police force anymore. You start mouthing off about gay people or black people, you're going to be out in your ear before you know it. We don't even use words like manpower anymore. You've got to be aware of gender equality. 10 years ago, if you said something out of order, you might get a clip on the ear. Not anymore. These days, PC means more than police constable, and you'd better know it.
What happened to Abbott?
I've no idea. He went to hospital and we never saw him again.
There's a detective chief inspector who's been helping Hawthorne.
That'd be Rutherford. He always had a soft spot for Hawthorne, and he came up with this idea. It's almost like a parallel investigation. You were at the crime scene, you saw how we had to leave everything in place for Hawthorne to come along and make his deductions. He reports directly to Rutherford.
Bypasses the whole system. Meadows stopped himself. He had said more than he intended.
Rutherford won't talk to you, he added, so I wouldn't waste your time.
He looked at his watch.
Is there anything else?
I don't know. Is there anything else you can tell me?
No. Well, maybe there's something you can tell me. You've been following Hawthorne around. Has he spoken to a man called Alan Godwin?
I felt a cold sinking in my stomach. I had never thought that Meadows might try to use me to help him get ahead of Hawthorne in his investigation. It only occurred to me now that this might have been the real reason why he had agreed to meet me. I knew at once that I couldn't tell him anything. If Meadows suddenly announced the identity of the killer, it would be a complete disaster. There would be no book. At the same time, I was aware of a sense of loyalty to Hawthorne that must have developed over the past few days, because I'd certainly never noticed it before. We were a team. We, not Meadows or anyone else, were going to solve the crime. I haven't been to all the interviews, I said weakly.
I'm not sure I believe that.
Look, I'm sorry. I really can't talk to you about what Hawthorne is doing. We made an agreement. It's confidential. Meadows looked at me the way he might look at someone who has beaten up an old-age pensioner or killed a child. I had met him on 3 separate occasions, and had considered him slow, inferior, even oafish. I suppose, in my mind's eye, I had been casting him as a yap, a Lestrade, a burden, the man who never solves the crime. Now I saw that I had underestimated him. He could be dangerous too.
You don't seem to know a lot about anything, Anthony, he said. But I take it you've heard of obstruction.
Yes.
Obstructing a police officer in the execution of their duty under the Police Act of 1991. You could be fined £1,000 or sent to jail.
That's ridiculous, I said. And it was. This wasn't Scotland Yard, it was the Groucho Club. And I'd invited him here.
I'm asking you a simple question.
Ask him, I said, holding his gaze. I had no idea what he was going to do. But then, quite suddenly, he relaxed. The cloud had passed. It was as if that little bit of nastiness had never happened.
I forgot to mention, he said. My son got very excited when he heard I was going to meet you.
Did he? I'd been drinking gin and tonic. I took a sip.
Yeah, he's a big fan of Alex Rider.
I'm delighted to hear it.
As a matter of fact...
Suddenly, Meadows was sheepish. He'd been carrying a leather briefcase, and he reached into it. I knew what was going to happen next. Over the years, I've come to know the body language so well. Meadows pulled out a copy of Skeleton Key, the 3rd Alex Rider novel. It was brand new. He must have stopped at a bookshop on the way to the club.
Will you mind signing it?
He asked. It's a pleasure. I took out a pen. What's his name?
Brian.
I opened the book and wrote on the first page, To Brian, I met your dad, and he almost arrested me. All good wishes. I signed it and handed it back. It's been a pleasure meeting you, I said. Thank you for your help.
I think you said you were going to pay me for my time.
Yes. I reached for my wallet. £50, I said. He looked at his watch.
Actually, we've been here 1 hour and 10 minutes.
As long as that.
And it took me 30 minutes to get here.
He left with £100. I'd also paid for 3 cocktails and signed his book. And what had I got in return? I wasn't sure it had been much of a deal. 17. Canterbury. For once I was looking forward to meeting Hawthorne, and I saw that he was in a good mood when I joined him the next day at King's Cross St Pancras.
He had already bought the tickets, and he asked me to fork out only for mine. We sat facing each other across a table as the train pulled out, but before I could begin a conversation, he suddenly produced a pad of paper, a pen, and a paperback book. I looked at the cover, upside down. The book was The Outsider by Albert Camus, translated from the French. It was a second-hand edition, a Penguin classic, with loose pages falling apart at the spine. I was very surprised. It had never occurred to me that Hawthorne would read anything, except maybe a tabloid newspaper. He really didn't strike me as someone who had any interest in fiction, and certainly not in the study of a young nobody plumbing the depths of existentialism in 1940s Algiers. If anyone had asked me, I would have imagined him settling back with a Dan Brown novel, perhaps, or maybe something more violent. Harlan Coben or James Patterson. Even that was a stretch. Hawthorne was clever, and he was well educated, but he didn't strike me as having any interior, imaginative life at all. I didn't want to interrupt, but at the same time I was itching to tell him my theory, the solution to the murders of Diana Cooper and her son. And after 15 minutes, sitting in silence with London slipping behind me, I couldn't resist it any more. He had read 3 pages in this time, by the way, turning them over with a decisiveness that suggested each one of them had been an effort, and he was glad that he would never have to return to them again. "You enjoying it?" I asked.
"What?"
"L'étranger." He looked blank, so I had translated. "The Outsider."
"It's all right."
"So you like modern literature, then?" He knew I was digging, and he was briefly irritated. But for once, he actually volunteered some information.
"I didn't choose it."
"No?"
"It's my book group."
Hawthorne in a book group. If he told me he was part of a knitting circle, it would be equally incongruous. "I read it when I was 18, I said. "It had quite an effect on me. I identified with Meursault." Meursault is the title character. He drifts through the novel. Today my mother died, or maybe yesterday. Kills an Arab, goes to prison, dies. It was the bleakness of his outlook, his lack of connectivity, that appealed to me. As a teenager, there was a part of me that wished I could be more like him.
"Trust me, mate. You're nothing like Meursault,"
Hawthorne replied. He closed the book.
"I meet people like him all the time. They're dead inside. They go out, and they do stupid things, and they think the world owes them a living. I wouldn't write about them. I wouldn't read about them either, except it wasn't my choice."
"So who's in the book group?" I asked.
"Just people."
I waited for him to tell me more.
"They're from the library."
"When do you meet?" He said nothing. I looked out of the window at the rows of terraced houses backing onto the railway line, tiny gardens separating them from the endless rattle of the trains. There was litter everywhere. Everything was covered in grey dust. "What other books have you read?" I asked.
"What you want about?"
"I'd like to know." He thought back. I could see he was getting annoyed.
"Lionel Shriver. A book about a boy who kills his schoolmates. That was the last one."
"We need to talk about Kevin. Did you like it?"
"She's clever. She makes you think."
He stopped himself. There was a danger that this was going to turn into a conversation.
"You should be thinking about the case," he said.
"As a matter of fact, I am." Hawthorne had given me exactly the opening I had been hoping for. I leapt in. "I know who did it." He looked up at me with eyes that were both challenging and waiting for me to fail.
"So who was it?"
he asked. "Alan Godwin," I said. He nodded, slowly, but not in agreement.
"He had a good reason to kill Diana Cooper," he said. "But he was at the funeral, at the same time as us. You think he had time to cross London and get to Damien's flat?"
"He left the cemetery as soon as the music started playing, and who else would have put the MP3 player in the coffin, if it wasn't him? You heard what he told us. It was his dead son's favourite song." I went on before he could stop me. "This has got to be about Timothy Godwin. It's the reason why we're on this train. And the simple fact is that nobody else had any reason to kill Diana Cooper. Was it the cleaner, because she was stealing money, or Raymond Clunes with his stupid musical? Come on. I'm surprised we're even arguing about it."
"I'm not arguing,"
Hawthorne said with equanimity. He weighed up what I had just said, then shook his head sadly.
Damien Cooper was at home when the accident happened. He had nothing to do with it. So what was the motive for killing him?